Hi, and welcome back to the 5th episode of our podcast series, On My Honor. It's been several months since we did any of these. As you know, we launched our first video podcast in November of last year, talking about the traditions and values that used to and should still define Washington and Lee University. Today, I have a good friend of mine, Iain MacLeod, class of 2022, to speak to us about his understanding of student body governance. When Iain was at W&L and even after he's graduated, he was a staunch proponent of traditional honor at Washington and Lee. He did a lot of research in the archives and wrote some great pieces in the W&L Spectator for the traditional view of our alma mater's student self-governance. So I've invited Iain here today during Alumni Weekend to tell us a little more about that process, that experience, and some advice he has for the current students that are going through the honor system. Iain, I always start this with students. You're actually the first alum I've had on this program. But tell me what brought you to Washington and Lee, and did you know anything about it beforehand?
Yeah, I think I knew about as much about Washington Lee as you can before coming here. My mom was an alumna, class of 1992. She was actually in the fourth class of women here at Washington and Lee. And honestly, I think the best way to put it is I was kind of raised on the honor system. Like as far back as I can remember, there was a very definite imperative, like never lie, cheat, and steal. You just do not do it. And the consequences are high. And she always, spoke very highly of and referred back to her time here and how that had just built such a strong foundation for her in every aspect of her life afterwards, how she dealt with people.
That's really interesting. Most of our guests, if not all of them that have been on this program, didn't really know much about Washington and Lee before coming here, and certainly not the honor system. So for you, it seems the opposite. We might even say the honor system is what led you to come here, knowing how important it was.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that was the biggest real draw in a lot of ways. I mean, there were other things at the recruiting level. Like I like the small classes, access to professors. That's a big draw, all that sort of thing. And then, mom, she wasn't really trying to, stack the deck. But when I was 9 years old, first time I hit campus, I loved history. She walked me around, got to go in the buildings, see all the, pretty old buildings and, the cool old desks, stuff like that.
Did you see Lee Chapel on that visit?
Yeah, we went through the chapel. Yeah, went through Lee Chapel, see the crypt. They still had the museum down there at the time and the little store where
I've heard stories about that.
Yeah. No, it was.
You're an old person
apparently.
Yeah.
I know. It was great. But then, dinner at Palms, ice cream cone and sweet things. And by the end of it, despite the fact I was 9 years old, I was like, nope, I'm done. I want to come here.
Well,
figured it out.
Let's jump, I guess, 9 years later or so.
Yeah.
You come back to Washington and Lee as a student. Tell me a little bit about that onboarding process, particularly how that honor orientation went. I've asked everyone about that, and most students don't remember it 6 months after the fact, but you seem to have a pretty fond recollection of it.
Yeah, I definitely don't remember everything, but I do remember it. I remember I did not enjoy a week at all very much by and large. Just the constant back and forth getting, shunted around to this info session or other was a lot, when you first hit campus. And then we started talking about, honor orientation. We go into the chapel and I was like, all right, now we're doing what I'm here for. And it was, I'm under the understanding it hasn't changed that much, really, maybe even since my mom was there. Like we all had to go in, sit down. President Dudley may have spoken. I don't remember, to be honest. I do remember the EC president spoke at some length. I remember thinking at the time, and we'll expand on this as we go here, that the speech was a little watered down. I felt like a little bit vague about what honor actually was. I remember thinking at the time, well, that's a little odd. I might have been a little more upfront about that. They did the whole deal where they get up there and they're like, you're either in or you're out. And then they stop talking for a while and everyone just gets to sit there and sweat for a few minutes. And then they, kind of let you go. And over that evening, you sign I guess they call it the honor book. It's not technically a white book, but
and so you signed that.
Yeah, they had it placed up on a podium outside of Graham Lee's. I think they may have done it staged by halls or something. I don't remember exactly, but I remember it was dark by the time I got out there, and put a big old John Hancock on. I was like, you only get to do this once. Let's go.
Well, that's interesting. That was 2018.
That was 18. Fall of 18. Yeah.
It used to be, and this makes sense, that the white book signing was actually in Lee Chapel, and I don't know at what point it migrated over. my year was odd because it was the COVID year. So we had our orientation on Zoom, and then the white book was, it was like quarantine, social distance signing. And so a lot of people in my year didn't even sign the book. But it seems like even in your time pre-COVID, early in President Dudley's administration, honor was still emphasized, and there was still that process.
The process was definitely still there. Actually, to your point on where it was signed, I vaguely remember some conversation around that. I think it might have been very shortly before my year that they changed it from Inley Chapel to, I guess it would have been outside Graham Lees, because you're halfway between Graham Lees and Gaines at that point. So that still works.
The quad area.
Yeah. But yeah, it was, the processes were very much still there. My understanding is there's been a little bit of an erosion of some of that over time, which is not great to hear.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. You were pretty involved as a student, as a writer for the W&L Spectator. But one of the things you seemed to focus on largely was the honor system. I think if they needed an expert on the honor system, on student governance, they could probably call you up and you could, be a helpful ear, or you could have them read one of your great pieces. But tell me a little bit about why you got interested in writing about this in the first place. I mean, why as a student did you feel like you needed to have dialogue on the honor system or whatever components of it?
Yeah, so that goes back in some ways to my freshman year, a little after that, because I kind of mentioned it during the orientation, something didn't quite stick right in my head, And then I also remember at some point shortly after that, I took a read through the white book and I did not see lying, cheating, and stealing mentioned anywhere. And that surprised me.
The white book, right? Just the sort of student manual for those that don't know. And it's your code of conduct revised every, 3 years or so?
Theoretically, cover that too. But theoretically, there's a review committee every 3 years. But I remember reading, being like, this is very weird. Because for me, it's like you're raised on the honor system. You hear about it so much, but it was always lying, cheating, and stealing. You don't do it. I was like, this is weird. It's not in here. And I guess, I regret this in hindsight, but you're a freshman, there's so much going on. I kind of fell into just this, wasn't too worried about it. Like in a weird way, I think my experience with the honor system to that point maybe didn't help me there, because my mindset was, well, honestly, I'm not super concerned about this, because like my mindset is I'm always going to behave honorably, period. And as long as I do that, like even if they've tweaked something in here over the years, who cares? Because like I'm not going to behave in a way that like I need to worry about that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the status quo up to through my sophomore year, into around COVID. So we all kind of go home for COVID. And then leading into my junior year and then into my senior year, there were kind of three big things that changed how I looked at the state of the honor system nowadays.
Something that radicalized you, perhaps.
Radicalized is the wrong word. I think it really woke me up to the problems with where the system has drifted to in the past few decades, and that things need to change, or that the honor system could. I would say, we'll get to why I think this, but I think the honor system is in a very tenuous place. You might say it's on life support, and we're one or two steps away from it dying effectively.
Wow. So what were those three things?
So there were three things. So one of them was what I call name change gate, and it was summer of 2020.
I remember it well.
Some watching this podcast may remember that there was a big debate in 2020 and into 2021 about whether Washington Lee should change its name to remove Robert E. Lee from the name. Before that even really hit kind of the airwaves and with the administration, the executive committee, they send out an email. They're like, we're going to do a survey about issues of, I believe it was perceptions about issues of race and Confederate monuments on campus. And I was like, okay, this is 2020. A lot of folks are very concerned about this. Okay, I mean, survey makes sense. But 2 days after that, suddenly this email hits everybody's inbox basically saying the EC is issuing a statement supporting a name change of Washington Lee University, full stop. And myself and a number of others were like, whoa, this is extremely partisan. This This ignores the value that Lee gave to the school as a president. It's one thing, every committee member is going to have their opinion, just like every student has their opinion. But when the committee comes out, and a committee that can decide if someone gets kicked out if they get accused of an honor violation, and then is also purportedly representing the whole campus, when they come out and they just make a blatantly partisan statement, sets off a lot of alarm bells.
Well, and it misrepresents the demographics on campus, right? It misrepresents, because you certainly
really
didn't tell your class rep that, I'm really concerned about the name. And this is important because that's a historical event now, right? I mean, people talk about it as if it were ages ago, and recently there was a student in a journalism class writing a piece on sort of campus conflict or something, and she reached out to me in my role with the Generals Redoubt and asked if I could speak on the name change subject, and started this interview, which we did here at Fancy Hill. Freshman lady, really nice. And she said, as I understand, the students supported a name change, the faculty supported a name change, but the trustees voted against it. And I said, whoa, let me stop you there. I said the students did not support a name change. There was obviously a faction, but that was never determined substantially. And I certainly think, it's fair to say a majority of students were in favor of keeping the name. But anyway, the EC vote is what she was referring to. And she had read this in some article or something, and had been misled to think that it was a more common sentiment than it had been.
No, I mean, as with most controversial issues, probably 20% of the campus was very strongly one way, maybe another 20% is very strongly the other way. You've got a gradation in the middle. But anyway, in some ways, the email they sent out was kind of just the beginning, because what was even worse in the aftermath was they held a town hall to discuss it, when a lot of folks suddenly send back emails like, okay, on what basis are you doing this? You have no basis for doing this based on the student body constitution and the white book. So they're like, okay, we'll hold a town hall. And then, to my shock, logging into that town hall, it was basically a couple of particular EC representatives who, as it turns out, were very in favor of that decision. And as I found out later, had driven that statement, and in some ways almost kind of bullied a lot of other EC members into supporting the statement.
Yeah, well, and that doesn't surprise anyone. I mean, it was 2020 was the summer of concession, right? And nobody wanted to step on the toes of what was going on in this national movement. So there are a lot of people that didn't agree with things, but just kind of feeling the water, didn't really want to speak out against it. And so you had these more radical decisions made nationally, not just at W&L, but I think that is symptomatic of that time.
I think that's fair. What was disappointing was that those members basically tried to belittle and shame and go after anyone who got on that town hall and spoke up against the decision. And I mean, you want to talk about shattering trust. We're sitting there and it's like, okay, and again, the reminder, these are the folks where if someone gets accused of an honor violation, they decide if you get kicked out of school or not. And it was a trust shattering event. And then it also felt like there was a definite sense of folks of certain persuasions being potentially ignored. Like, I wrote up a letter that I sent to my class representative, never heard back, not even a perfunctory, thanks for taking the time to send this. Whereas folks of the pro-change persuasion, I heard a lot of stories where they were very directly engaged with and very...
well, and this was the same executive committee that my freshman year, when I had the retain the name banner in Commons, and it was stolen not once, but twice, zip ties cut, walked off on camera, students caught because I reported to public safety. Neither of those students were found guilty of an honor violation. And I know there was a process for at least one of them, because I was called before the EC and they asked me all these questions. But that executive committee decided, for whatever reason, that stealing a $200 banner, with obviously with cause, because they brought scissors to cut the zip ties, that wasn't a violation of the community's trust. So I can get the sort of political maneuvering and the lack of trust that would invoke in the executive committee and student governance altogether.
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't even think it should really be a partisan issue. I think engaging with our history is just essential. Period. So anyway, but that's really not the point. The bottom line was, as far as the honor system is concerned, it was this kind of shocking moment of oh no, like what is wrong? Like the executive committee should not be able to do this. And just to briefly kind of double click on the student body constitution, there are multiple provisions in there putting limitations on how meetings should be run. There's supposed to be a notice sent out to the student body that an official meeting is going to be held. And there's supposed to be a portion of that meeting set aside for a so-called an open portion of the meeting where any student can come in and comment. And none of that happened. This was effectively just like, over the summer, I guess it must have been on Zoom since it was COVID. They're all getting on a Zoom call and just deciding to do this stuff.
Yeah.
And there was little to no accountability in the short term. And then the second thing that really got me thinking was when COVID-19 breaks out, the university policies regarding COVID-19 were draconian. Like it was pretty much you stay in your room and you bundle yourself up and you go to class. Don't breathe, don't do anything like that. And then you go back to your dorm. The rules changed constantly. And to be clear, these aren't the white book rules or anything like that. This is just the administrative, like how many masks do you have to wear? Like how many feet do you have to be away from folks at any given time?
Right. How many people can be in a room?
Right. Those sorts of things. And there was this very like kind of you're looking over your shoulder constantly. It's like if you get caught doing something you're not supposed to do, whether you even knew or not, never mind any question of is this appropriate or not. You could get written up, like cited.
Fined or even kicked off campus.
Kicked off campus. They tended to only kick people off campus if they were pretty flagrantly violating larger rules like having parties and stuff like that. That's a whole different discussion. But what disturbed me, again, back to the honor system, is there were multiple EC reps at the time, some of who had been the same ones who had supported name change out of nowhere over the summer and who had driven that process, started talking about, community trust is very important during a pandemic scenario. And maybe there should be consideration of it being an honor violation if you violate a COVID policy. And that was very disturbing. One, because the honor system is student-led, and there was nothing student-led about these policies.
Right.
Frankly, they change so often, I'm not sure the administration knew what they were doing, frankly.
Yeah, well, no, nobody did. But to consider that being an honor violation would definitely be a huge concern.
I would say it's absurd because the purpose of the honor system is self-discipline, self-regulation of conduct, and you have to have a basis on which to do that. And the total subjectivity of whatever the COVID policy is that nobody knew where it came from or why it was there, and just the absolute lack of student input was just unacceptable. So that's kind of point number 2 where I'm like, all right, something's wrong here. And to be clear, I don't think any students ever would have been kicked off. It was a couple of particular EC representatives that were suggesting this. And that was actually a point where some of the other EC representatives were like, actually, no, this would never be a thing. And they tended to back down and be like, oh, well, it would only be in the worst of situations or something like that. But, damage is done.
Even the thought that it's potential
like,
could definitely
it's like damage is done. Like this is major violation of trust on the part of what are supposed to be your representatives, and who can kick you out of campus to again. And then, kind of the third point that really triggered me into like, all right, I got to really think about where the honor system is now is early in my senior year. It was really funny. My mom and I, obviously, like I said, grew up on the honor system, talked about Washington and Lee, plenty talked about the honor system, but somehow we'd never discussed what was and wasn't in the white book. So I remember it was some point early my senior year, I mentioned in a conversation, well, lying, cheating, and stealing aren't in the white book. She was like, what do you mean they're not in the white book? They've always been in the white book. And I had to hunt down, I think I probably had to Google it because I think I was on break at the time, but I had to here is the current white book. Like it's not here. Yeah. And she's like, this is terrible. What happened? Like this definition is completely subjective. And I looked at it again for the first time in, a year or two. And I was like, yeah, this is just like completely subjective.
This conversation's been happening a lot in my earlier podcasts, and alumni listening to these videos still shocked to hear. I mean, every time I talk to an alum and they're shocked that lying, cheating, stealing aren't honor violations. Cause that's as basic as it gets. So your mother's reaction is I think the shared alumni consensus when it comes to that. People are shocked that changed. So when did that happen?
So this is probably fall of 2021, sometime, I don't know, maybe Thanksgiving break or something like that. And really thinking, it was like, it jarred me. And then like the experience with the EC really stepping out on a limb in terms of not representing people, breaking trust on a couple different occasions, really made me think harder about, okay, where are we? And like, I've now seen multiple examples of this subjectivity. Like the EC representatives, they're at each other, they're at the students.
Sure.
Like there's all this conflict. I need to go down and figure out what happened. So I went down in special collections and I asked them, do you have old white books? And they're like, yeah, we have a folder with some old white books. And I was like, can I see them? She's like, yeah, sure. So end up pulling them out. And this became, to be clear, I was down there several times over the course of a couple months doing this research. But what I effectively discovered was that starting in the late 1990s, you could actually track iteratively on intervals of 3 to 5 years the textual deterioration of the white book from a stronger standard based in objective morality. You will not lie, cheat, or steal. That is the anchor, and you are expected to, always strive to be honorable at all times. You could actually watch the deterioration, like kind of period over period. And I don't remember the exact language, but I remember it was in, I think, the 2000 and 2001 year. So because this is a while ago, this is when I was born. Honor is first redefined in such a way that the concept is subjective. I think it was like kind of an early version of community trust standard as exists now, if I remember correctly. By 2000, but lying, cheating, and stealing are still there as clear examples. 2005 to 6 academic year, I believe, it was changed so that now lying, cheating, and stealing are only historical examples of honor violations. And then I think it was the 2015 and 16 year, they're gone altogether, just not there anymore. And it was a little disturbing realizing that the honor system had been deteriorating badly for more than 2 decades at that point. And based on, you're reading between the lines, and just to like skip a couple steps, like that 3 to 5 year interval, that's white book review cycles. So the executive committee is required, right now it's on 3-year cycles. It may have been more or less in the past, to review the white book and suggest changes, have a committee that does that.
Right.
And it was pretty clear based on the changes that this is the next cycle. Then they're changing these things, and we're successively just eroding the honor system.
And it would be a different group of students each time, right? The next generation of students.
Right. On a 3-year interval, theoretically, you might have some overlap, but I've kept an eye on these since then. It seems like I can't think of a situation where there's been overlap committee over committee. And, it might be fair to say that each group is coming in and they're making what they think is, a change.
Right.
Just sort of like, oh, this sort of makes sense right now. But it was alarming to see how over 4 or 5 cycles, something like that, you had this gross weakening of the system to the point where we end up with what is in the white book now, which is basically anything that's a violation of the community's trust.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It is completely subjective. And that's what I had seen examples of, like, the whole name change gate thing. Like they were concerned about trying to be activists, but it's like, okay, where does that fit into community trust?
Right.
Huge debate.
Well, and I remember in one of these honor hearings when my banner was stolen, my Retain the Name banner, and one of the questions I was asked by a progressive member of the executive committee who very much wanted to rename the school, and she said, well, what was the message on the banner? And I was like, well, not that it matters, but it said retain the name. And she asked a question of, well, do you see why some people might want to have that removed? And I mean, they were pushing back on this notion that my position was that they stole something that was my property, therefore they committed an honor violation. And mind you, I only put this banner up after the progressive student group had put up a banner that said change the name, and I got permission to put my banner up in the same spot after. And I didn't like the message of the first banner. I didn't go cut it and remove it, though I'm sure if I did, those EC members would have used their subjective definition of what an honor violation is to press a little harder and say, well, you took down this message of change the name. So that subjectivity is a problem. Anecdotally, for me, I have a clear example where it was used wishy-washy to sort of take stealing and say, well, that's not a violation. The same thing this last fall. Obviously, you weren't on campus for it, nor was I, but a law student uses AI specifically against instructions on a prompt and admits using it, admits doing that, and is not convicted in a public hearing of an honor violation because the jury didn't consider that a violation of the community's trust. 50 years ago, obviously AI wasn't a thing, but 50 years ago, stealing a banner, not following the prompt, basically plagiarizing, clear honor violations, but that has weakened over time. And I think you have done great research to show that this seems to be a linear progression that you can track as to how this has enabled this weakening of the system.
Yeah, it was, at least for a time. What's been interesting is there actually has not been, that I've seen in that kind of primary, I think it's called the preamble now, a lot of change since that last change in 1516 that put us on this full community trust framework. I think that's interesting, but you really can't see the instability in the system as a result. Like what you're describing, like the point, if someone stole something, they stole something. If someone lies, they lies. If they cheat, they cheat. Like this just is not rocket science. And the purpose of the honor system is to give students an opportunity to train themselves, to elevate their conduct to effectively the highest standard of conduct they can imagine. And you have to have an elevated consequence to do that. That's what the single sanction's for. That's why lying, cheating, and stealing are there. It's not because they're the worst things that you can ever do, but it's because when folks have to grapple with that, they're going to adjust their conduct accordingly. And this is what people miss, is most people stop right there and they're like, oh no, culture of fear. And it's like, well, that's not what we had here for 70, 80 years before some of these changes start, probably longer than that, before these changes start happening. We had the highest trust factor, I guess you might call it, of anywhere. Like anyone who either attended here or even visited here often was like, whoa, this is totally unique.
Yeah. People in the 1920s were writing up nationally about this institution because there was a self-ran candy store in Newcomb Hall where, there's no cashier at the cash register. People just came in, you buy a chocolate, you put whatever the monetary amount is into the register. And that got national attention because people were amazed that you just had trust with a bunch of 18-year-olds that they can go around and not steal chocolate bars, that it's just, and now, leave your backpack around, leave your computer around, not have to worry about it getting taken, leave, bicycles unlocked at whatever academic building.
So is that a problem now?
No, I'm just saying, like, that's the culture that the honor system has created. It's not a punitive, it's not a fearful culture. It's a trustworthy culture.
Right.
And so to remove that, and one of the things I frequently complain about is the executive committee, the White Book Review Committee, any of these people that are in charge of student government, I don't really think they're doing, by and large, the historical research they need to be doing to appreciate the system. For example, the White Book Review Committee, every time they do this process, they should go through and look at every single former White Book, like you did. And I don't know that they do that. I don't know that they don't do it. But that level of due diligence probably is not done. And consequence of that, I think you get somebody looking at their White Book in the moment and saying, okay, well, this sentence we can change and put it this way. And they don't realize how much they've deviated from that gold standard 50 years before.
Yeah, and it's very possible that any given review committee does look at those historical standards and says, we still want to make this more subjective, because there's a lot of folks who make the philosophical argument that it should effectively all be subjective, which I vehemently disagree with, but that's very much a factor as well. I actually weirdly, I do think that there was some inadvertence-ness, you might say, to how it occurred, because it really did feel like boiling the frog 1 degree at a time, but the consequences are profound. And I think we've seen that in the last 10 years or so.
So you've traced this linear change in the White Book and student governance. Do you have any predictions of what you think the next big change might be? And I know that they just approved a bunch of amendments to the White Book, and we'll touch on those briefly, but another episode I'm doing will go more in detail. But I mean, if we're sort of trickling downhill, your fear about what one cycle might decide in 3 years and 5 years, whatever, to change from the current standard?
The honor system rested on really two things. It was the establishment of the high standard of conduct to which we all aspire, never lie, cheat, or steal, and the high consequence that you pay for violating that standard. Single sanction, you will be kicked out. It doesn't matter what it is. One of those things has been removed. The system is not dead. It is on life support. And if the single sanction ever goes, that's it. The system's gone. And I'm sure if that ever happened, so we still have honor system. We still have white book. I will say the trials, they have good procedures. Like that's a pretty good procedural layout for trials and stuff like that. But, the system would be dead. It would probably devolve into some sort of code of conduct, which would be useless because all a code of conduct is doing is prohibiting certain behaviors, which thereby implies that any other behavior is acceptable, and it completely abrogates the real goal of the honor system, which is that you will always behave honorably. And if you take away the single sanction, it's gone. I have heard recently that this last DC actually was considering recodifying lying, cheating, and stealing in the honor system, which would have been a tremendous positive step.
But that didn't happen.
Did not happen is what I've heard. It theoretically could still happen. It would be a matter of, I think they're doing another white book review committee this next year. So I guess.
Yeah, because the one this year was called out of cycle by the executive committee, right? Can you speak a little more on that?
It was very, it's kind of a funny thing. There are kind of two different documents that the executive committee is kind of in charge of executing both. You've got the white book, which governs the honor system, and you have the student body constitution, which kind of collectively governs the EC's other functions, the administrative, some of their like administrative liaison stuff versus like administration of student clubs as well, that kind of thing. The white book is by and large a very good document, I would say. Effectively, it's pretty cohesive. The student body constitution, what was interesting is in the aftermath of kind of that name change situation, some of the other stuff, I dug around in the student body constitution. It's not a great document. It's pretty ambiguous at points. There's some points where it's almost self-contradictory.
Oh, wow.
And it seems like when there come to be controversial situations where the EC's under fire, there was that situation with the name change. There was one a couple years later where the vice president was removed under debatable, suspicious circumstances. Spectator covered it. I wrote an article on what I kind of learned secondhand. I won't pretend I knew all the details, but what I find is when those things happen, the EC tends to cut corners on the student body constitution, and they don't care.
Yeah,
and that
I remember. The university infamously renames Lee Chapel, and I think the student body constitution starts with a preamble or something that says students gathering in Lee Chapel in 1905 or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
And I had noticed after the name of the chapel was changed officially by the university, not the federal designation,
right?
That the student body constitution changed to say University Chapel. And I reached out to the EC president and I said, look, I don't think this was a, proposed amendment that people voted on according to the bylaws, whatever. And the president actually got back to me. This was 4 years ago or something, and said, oh, you're right. I apologize. We'll turn it back. So as far as I know, that is still Lee Chapel. I haven't looked in a year
curious.
or so.
I'd have to go back and
hopefully
see.
that and the reason it hadn't passed is because not enough. Those amendments typically struggle to get enough votes, even just student turnout.
Yeah.
But that's one of the positive things I want to sort of end this podcast on is there seems to have been such bad examples of the honor system not working this year or in recent memory. Certainly you brought up many, I brought up some, that it has sparked a sort of vigor among the student body for self-governance. And whether everybody has the same position we do or not, isn't necessarily the case. But students are more interested. And so the election results this time around, the Ringtum Fire had a great article on this, which you won't often hear me say. But they wrote about student election participation this year. And it was like in the 60%,
Really?
high 60s, I think, which is great. I mean, that's way better than national average. It's way better than W&L's.
Well, and that's
average.
by far the highest we've seen since I've been around. We might have gotten a little over 50%. There was the EC election after at the end of that, my junior year, the 2020 year, there were some there were some very sort of polarized tickets that ran
there were
in that
like
process.
The progressive ticket was one
there was
on that platform.
There was decently high participation that time. I think it was over 50%, but I'm not sure I've ever seen over 60.
Yeah. So, and I think I think every position except maybe one went contested.
Okay.
I remember one year when I ran, I was the only contested position and I lost.
Right.
But like nobody, and a lot of the seats didn't even have anybody running. So I don't want people to think everything's awful and that, student body's falling apart and that there's no hope, because I think we have a very revitalized concern among a large portion of the W&L community that says, hey, the way things have gone haven't been well. We need to be more sort of retroactive or proactive in our defense of traditional honor at W&L. So hopefully that means good things. And I have the next episode is with the new EC president, John Beekman Youngblood, whose campaign speech we recently published. And, he certainly is aligned with, I think, the position that we hold of the single sanction being critical and, the importance of codifying lying, cheating, and stealing. So maybe there's hope that this next year when this cycle reoccurs, that can get inserted, and then you can have a linear, improvement.
Man, that would be profound.
Yeah.
It's tough because the one thing I forgot to mention talking about the student body constitutions earlier is this was supposed to be a constitutional review committee.
Right.
So this whole review this year was interesting. It was a little sketchy at first when I read about it. What made sense was
definitely didn't seem
the EC delegated the role of also considering white book amendments. I don't love the idea of if this same delegation precedent becomes a thing, like then you have the honor system being evaluated, 2 years out of 3. That's probably a lot of stress and, debate. I think every third year is appropriate as that way to make sure the student body, each successive group of students is engaging, but you go more often than that. It almost becomes like, okay, are we overdoing it? Are we putting undue stress on the system by litigating everything constantly?
Well, yeah, and it almost takes a controversy to spark good change, right? I mean, you talked about events that are rare that sort of encourage you to get really involved in this process. So, COVID, name change, 2 things that hopefully don't ever happen again.
And to that point, I do think some of what you're talking about, I agree that obviously I'm not as close to campus or on campus as frequently as you are, but I do think there seems to be more awareness, more focus on it, more thoughtful consideration of the honor system right now. And that's great. I do think it feels like a lot of that does go back to 2020. I know in, my own small way, I've been trying, going special collections, trying to get all that history out in front of folks at the Spectator. I mean, you just do whatever you can. And it feels like a lot of folks have been doing whatever they can. And it does feel like there's more momentum behind at least seriously considering what the honor system about and what the consequences of changing this or that will be. Obviously, lying, cheating, and stealing need to be recodified. This idea of a totally uncodified subjective system does not work. We've seen it not work. It's unacceptable because it switches. It's just completely ambiguous.
Well, we need good grounded rules and advice to shape students into good alumni, good citizens. And I just want to close, Iain, you're in the workforce now. Was the honor system, was that a positive impact on your professional career? I mean, how has that shaped your actual day-to-day life now?
It's almost hard to characterize because, like I said, I grew up with it. So it's in a lot of ways the ethos has been shaping me going back to my early childhood. But it's definitely just like when in doubt, I'm going to ask the question, I think maybe is the best way I would put it. When, when I'm at work and I'm not sure about something, I would much rather ask the question, make sure I'm in bounds, make sure I'm doing the appropriate thing versus just wing it and hope.
Hope that your boss is pretty subjective and
no, not at all. Actually,
No,
I work with a bank, so there's a lot of policies and procedures. I honestly,
you
in some
can't
ways,
lie, cheat, or steal, right, in your job.
right. It's honestly not a workplace where I feel like you're being stressed in that way that much. It really just it changes your outlook on everything. It's like whether you're at work or whether you're dealing with friends, whatever you do in your spare time. It's like, for me, I love to play golf, even on the golf course. It's just like you play it straight up.
Yeah.
Play the ball as it lies, that sort of thing. It's just, it really is kind of a way of life, and it elevates your conduct and the way that you present yourself to others, the way you treat others. And it's a profoundly positive thing.
Well, thank you so much, Iain, for coming and speaking on this. I know if anybody has any questions about Iain's research or any other views he has, I'm sure he'd be happy to talk more about it. We're always texting back and forth whenever something comes up. But thanks for coming out and joining this. Hope you have a good rest of your alumni weekend. And thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this series. We've got some more episodes in the pipeline, and hope you'll have some good content throughout this summer. Thanks, and go Generals.